Hi, Nan Jensen here. This is video number 9 about trusts, and there may be a video 10 as well, I'm not quite sure yet. Before I get started, I just want to do my disclaimer. The information in these videos is information only, it is not legal advice, so you mustn't rely on anything you hear here. If you need legal advice, you need to speak to a lawyer. You need to get a letter of engagement and you need to tell them your whole situation. Right, so let's get on with the subject. The subject of the video is trusts, and specifically how trusts can be used to support a person with a disability. Now, before I get started, I just want to talk about what trusts are and how they came about. The reason I do this is because trusts are actually quite a difficult subject to understand. And I found it the hardest one that we had in law school. And I do want to just pay a quick tribute to Sue Tappenden, who was my law school lecturer about trusts, because I think she's the one who told us this little story about the history of trusts. So a trust is a really old concept, and it originated in England way back in, I think, in the Middle Ages or whenever they were having the Crusades. And back then, women could not own land, only men could own land. And of course, they didn't have an electronic land transfer register. So in order to prove that you owned a piece of land, you had to hold the deed. So it was a piece of paper that was the deed over the land, and when you had that deed, then you owned that land. And you may remember from, if you've had any history, that back then there were these lords who held big tracts of land, and they had peasants or serfs who worked the land for them, and that was basically how the lords made money. It was a kind of a barter economy, I guess. And what was happening around that time, of course, was that the Crusades were happening, and some of these lords decided they wanted to go off and fight in the Crusades. And so when they left, they couldn't give the deed to the wife because the wife wasn't allowed to own land. So they would usually give it to their neighbor, so the lord next door. And that neighbor would then hold the deed, and they'd say, well, can you hold on to it and make sure my wife and children are looked after until I get back? So, of course, sometimes the lord did come back and the neighbor would give him his deed back, but sometimes he'd get killed and he didn't come back. And of course, if the lord was a good guy, he'd continue to run the property and get the serfs to do the work so that the wife and children of the original owner continued to be looked after properly. But if he wasn't such a nice guy, he might say, oh, well, I've got the deed, this is my land, and the wife and the children then became serfs, and now that lord had twice as much land. So the courts became a bit concerned about these developments because it apparently started happening quite a bit, that the lord would go off and die and his wife and children became serfs. They obviously didn't care about the serfs that are already there, but they were concerned about the fairness of the wife and children losing their access to the land. So they could have changed the law so that women could own land, but that's not what they did. They set up this concept of a trust. And so the language that we use around trusts is actually old language from back at that time. So the idea with a trust, the basic idea, is that the trustees hold the trust property, whatever that may be, for the benefit of the beneficiaries, not for their own benefit. And so if you apply that to the example that I just gave, then the lord who's holding the deed is the trustee, so he's holding it for the benefit of the other lord's wife and children. They're the beneficiaries. He's not holding it for his own benefit. And he needs to manage that property to benefit them. So that's the basic idea of a trust, that the trustees manage property for the benefit of the beneficiaries. Now, some things have changed because now you can be a beneficiary and a trustee, but for the most part, that's the basic idea. And like I said, the language is still the same. So I'm just going to go through some of the vocabulary so that we're clear about the different roles that people can play in a trust and some of the basic terminology. So I'm just going to start with the first term, which is settlor or settlors. So we say that someone settles a trust, and therefore the person who set it up is the settlor or settlors if it's a couple. Now the settlor, it's S-E-T-T-L-O-R, not settler. So if you're trying to type that into Word, you probably get some sort of autocorrect, and you'll have to put it back to have an O in it. The settlors often, but not always, will have certain powers, and those powers often have to do with being allowed to appoint and will hire and fire, remove and replace trustees. Sometimes they also have the power to do that with beneficiaries. It really depends on the individual trust. And in your average family trust, the settlors are often mom and dad. Now, the next word that we're going to talk about is the trustee. So we already talked about what is a trustee. A trustee is a person who holds property not for their own benefit, or not necessarily for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the beneficiaries of the trust. And of course, why is it called a trustee? Because they're people that you trust. The trustees in your average family trust, they might be mom and dad. Nowadays, there's probably also an independent trustee. And an independent trustee normally means someone who's not also a beneficiary. But depending on the definition in that particular trust, it might mean something different. It might mean that they can't be a family member at all. It really depends on the individual trust. So the next word that I want to discuss is beneficiaries. And you can already hear that you can have more than one role in a trust. So beneficiaries are the people who are going to benefit from the trust assets. And those can be anyone that are chosen by the settlor. But in your average family trust, it's probably going to be mom and dad and their children, and probably their grandchildren as well. But again, it depends on that specific trust, because there's a lot of flexibility about what can actually be in a trust deed. The next one, which I already mentioned, is independent trustee. So an independent trustee, like I said, is going to be a trustee who is not a beneficiary. And depending on the restrictions in that particular trust, there may be other rules around who they can and can't be. Now, some people use what they call a professional independent trustee, so that might be an accountant or a lawyer. My personal view is that it's not necessary to use an accountant or a lawyer as an independent trustee. Your trust may need to hire a lawyer or an accountant depending on how complex the trust affairs are, and depending on how much you want to do yourself and how much you're feeling you need to pay professionals to take care of. I'm not clear about why you would need to have a professional trustee, that you would have to pay for that, but there may be situations where you need one. And one situation is a company that I'm actually involved in called the Disability Trustee, where we act as an independent trustee for situations where there's a disabled person as a beneficiary. But it's not something that we promote a lot, and not something that I encourage people to use, because I always think they're better off finding a trustee they don't have to pay, and someone who knows their family. The next one, I'm just looking at my list, well, that's the trust deed. So what is the trust deed? That's not the same as the deed we talked about before. A trust deed is the document that sets out the rules of the trust. And so that deed is going to it has a number of things that must be in it. For example, specifying who are the beneficiaries, who are the trustees, and basically what are the rules. And so if you are a trustee of a trust, it's really important that you have a copy of that deed, so you know what powers you have and what rules you need to follow. And there are also some rules that are in legislation. So if you are a trustee and you don't have a copy of your trust deed, I strongly suggest you get it, because you could be breaking those rules without realizing it. The last document that I'm going to talk about right now is a letter of wishes, and that's not actually a legal document. A letter of wishes is an important document. It's a good idea to have one with a trust, but not all trusts do have them. The letter of wishes is basically a letter from the settlor or settlors to the trustees that come after them. So it's not a will, it's a little bit like a will, because basically what you're doing is you're saying what you want to happen to the trust property, how the trust property should be managed when you're gone. Because as long as you're alive, you probably can express that to people orally. But once you're gone, other trustees are going to take over from you. And then you are going to need to have given them some guidance so they know what you want them to do. So the the letter of wishes might say something like, prioritize my disabled child over the other children because they're going to need more help. Or it might say, treat my children reasonably equally. It might say things like, I want this to only be used for medical emergencies, or it might say, I want this to ensure that my disabled child has a holiday each year. So there can be all different specifications. In my view, the more disabled your family member is and the less they're able to express their own wishes, the more important it is to give more information about how you think trust assets should be used, but also how they can benefit the disabled person. I can see that I'm starting to have used a lot of time, so I'll just end by saying a company can also be a trustee. It doesn't have to be an individual. I don't want to discuss that in too much detail because that can confuse people, but that is an option that can be discussed with a lawyer when you're setting up a trust. Now, I am going to make a second trust video, I realize now, because there's a lot more that I need to say. But I just want to say it's really important when setting up a trust that you have somebody, a lawyer involved who understands about disability, who understands about how WINS approaches trusts and what interest they take in trust and trust assets, so that you don't inadvertently disadvantage your disabled person. And also there's certain things that will apply back to what you might do with your will, for example. And we'll talk about that in the next video. Finally, I was waiting to get this done until I had memorized the entire new Trusts Act, which just came out in July. I've concluded that there's an awful lot to get my head around, and I'm not going to rush that process. The Act doesn't actually come into force until the beginning of 2022, so we have a bit of time, and I will update the videos with important information that needs to be updated there. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in video number 10, which will be a continuation about trusts.